The door slammed shut before Alina could even turn around, and the sound of the bolt sliding into place echoed through the empty street like a final judgment. Rain came down in sheets, soaking through her thin coat within seconds, and her hands trembled as she pressed them against the cold wood, hoping, praying that someone inside would change their mind. No one did. The house she had grown up in, the house where she had once laughed by the fireplace and shared meals with people who called themselves her family, was now closed to her forever. She stood there for a long moment, unable to accept what had just happened. Her father had not even looked at her when he said the words. Her mother had turned away, wiping her hands on her apron, as if Alina were nothing more than a stain to be removed. Her older sister had watched from the staircase with a look that was almost satisfied, as though she had been waiting for this moment for years. It had started with the collapse of her father's business, a string of bad decisions and worse luck that had drained every coin from the family's accounts. Debts arrived faster than answers, and when a wealthy merchant who had once promised to marry Alina withdrew his offer upon hearing of the family's ruin, something inside her father seemed to break. He needed someone to blame, and Alina, the youngest, the quietest, the one least able to defend herself, became that person. They called her unlucky. They said she had brought shame upon the household. They said terrible things, words that cut deeper than the cold rain now soaking through her boots, and then they told her to leave and never come back. Alina turned from the door and walked into the storm, clutching the small bag that held everything she now owned in the world: a spare dress, a hairbrush, a locket that had belonged to her grandmother, and a few coins that would not last more than a day or two. She had nowhere to go. She had no friends left, no relatives willing to take her in, no plan beyond putting one foot in front of the other. The streets of London at night were no place for a young woman alone, and she knew this. She had heard the warnings her whole life, warnings about the dangers lurking in the shadows, about men who preyed on those with nowhere to turn. But she had no choice now except to keep walking, to keep her head down, and to hope that the storm would hide her from anyone who might mean her harm. Hours passed. Her legs ached, her feet were numb, and the cold had settled so deeply into her bones that she could no longer feel her fingers wrapped around the handle of her bag. She passed grand houses with warm light glowing behind their curtains, families gathered inside, safe and dry, utterly unaware of the girl outside who had lost everything in a single evening. She passed alleyways where she heard voices she did not want to identify, and she quickened her pace each time, praying that no one would notice her. By the time she reached the edge of the wealthier district, her strength was nearly gone. She had not eaten since the morning, and the chill had turned into something more dangerous, a heaviness that made her thoughts blur and her steps grow uneven. She saw tall iron gates ahead, the entrance to an enormous estate that stretched back into darkness, its windows glowing faintly through the rain. She did not know whose home it was. She only knew that she could not take another step. Her knees gave out just short of the gate, and she fell onto the wet stone path, her bag slipping from her fingers. The last thing she remembered before the darkness took her was the sound of hurried footsteps and a voice calling out, sharp with alarm, asking if she was alive. The voice belonged to a young stable hand named Peter, who had been securing the horses for the night when he spotted a shape crumpled near the gate. He ran to her side immediately, pressing 2 fingers to her wrist and feeling with great relief the faint but steady beat of her pulse. He called for help, and within minutes 2 more members of the household staff arrived, lanterns swinging in the rain, faces tight with concern. They carried her inside, through a servant's entrance at the side of the grand house, and laid her on a bench in a small sitting room near the kitchen. The housekeeper, a stern woman named Margaret, arrived quickly, wiping flour from her hands onto her apron, as she surveyed the unconscious girl with a mixture of pity and suspicion. A young woman collapsing at the gate of a duke's estate was not a small matter. Margaret knew the rules of the house well. Strangers were not welcomed without explanation, and scandal was something the family could not afford, not with the delicate business dealings currently occupying the duke's attention. She considered, briefly, having the girl moved to a public shelter once she woke, somewhere far from the estate where no one could question why she had been found so close to the gates. But something about the girl's face gave Margaret pause. She was young, perhaps 20, with fine features that spoke of a life not always lived in poverty. Her clothes, though soaked and torn at the hem, were made of decent fabric, the kind a servant girl would never be able to afford. Her hands, though cold and trembling even in sleep, were soft, unused to hard labor. This was not a girl who had been born to the streets. Something had happened to bring her here, and Margaret found herself unable to simply cast her back out into the storm. The butler, an older man named Harold who had served the household for over 20 years, arrived a few minutes later and studied the girl with quiet thoughtfulness. He had seen many things in his years of service, and he had learned to trust his instincts about people. Something told him that this girl's story was worth hearing before any decisions were made about her fate. He ordered a fire to be lit in the small sitting room and a doctor to be sent for, just to be certain the girl had suffered no serious harm from her exposure to the cold. He also ordered dry blankets and something warm for her to drink once she woke. Margaret protested weakly, reminding him that the Duke had strict rules about strangers in the house, especially during a week as important as this one, with guests expected to arrive any day for his sister's house party. Harold merely nodded and said that they would explain everything to the Duke once he returned from his meetings in the city, and that no man, however powerful, would want it said that his household had turned away a dying girl from his own doorstep. Elinor did not wake until deep in the night. When her eyes finally opened, she found herself in an unfamiliar room, wrapped in blankets far softer than anything she had owned in years, a fire crackling nearby, casting warm light across polished wooden furniture. For a moment she believed she had died and this was some strange afterlife. Then the memories came rushing back, the rain, the cold, the long walk through unfamiliar streets, and she sat up so quickly that her head spun. A young maid sitting nearby noticed her movement and hurried to her side, offering a cup of warm broth and gentle words of reassurance. Elinor accepted the cup with shaking hands, still too disoriented to ask the many questions racing through her mind. Where was she? Whose house was this? What would happen to her now that she had recovered? The maid, whose name was Alice, explained as much as she knew. She told Elinor that she had been found unconscious near the gate and brought inside by the household staff. She told her that this was the estate of the Duke of Ashworth, one of the wealthiest and most respected noblemen in the region, though also known, according to whispered rumors among the staff, to be a man of few words and little patience for foolishness. Elinor's heart sank at the mention of a duke. She had no business being inside the home of a nobleman, no explanation that would not sound suspicious or desperate. She considered briefly, thanking the staff for their kindness and slipping away before anyone else noticed her presence, but her body was still too weak to attempt such an escape, and the storm outside had not yet passed. She spent the remainder of the night in that small sitting room, drifting in and out of uneasy sleep, haunted by dreams of slamming doors and cold rain. When morning finally arrived, she woke to the sound of hurried footsteps and voices in the hallway outside, voices that grew louder and more anxious with each passing moment. She soon understood why. The Duke had returned early from his business trip, arriving at the estate far sooner than anyone had expected, his mood already dark from a series of frustrating meetings that had failed to resolve a complicated matter involving one of his business partners. He had little patience left for surprises, and Margaret, catching him in the entrance hall, realized she now had the difficult task of explaining why a strange young woman was currently resting in one of the household's private rooms. Before Margaret could find the right words, however, something entirely unexpected happened. The Duke, distracted and irritated, glanced toward the open door of the sitting room and saw Elinor sitting there, pale but composed, wrapped in a blanket that had clearly been provided by his own staff. His expression shifted immediately, confusion giving way to something that looked almost like recognition, though clearly mistaken. He strode toward the room without waiting for an explanation from Margaret, his mind occupied with thoughts of the guests expected to arrive that week for his sister's house party, thoughts that had apparently led him to a hasty and incorrect conclusion about the identity of the young woman before him. Elinor watched him approach, her pulse quickening with fear. She had no idea what to say, no plan for how to explain her presence in his home. But before she could speak a single word, the Duke addressed her first, his tone formal but not unkind, and what he said next would change the entire course of her life, though neither of them yet understood the magnitude of the mistake that was about to unfold. He apologized for the delay in welcoming her properly, explaining that his business affairs had kept him occupied longer than expected. He said he hoped the journey had not been too difficult, especially given the terrible weather that had struck the region the previous night, and he expressed relief that his staff had taken good care of her upon her arrival. He then instructed Margaret, standing frozen in the doorway, to have the finest guest room prepared immediately, and to ensure that Miss Hastings received anything she required for her comfort during her stay. Elinor's breath caught in her throat. Miss Hastings. He believed she was someone else entirely, some expected guest whose arrival he had clearly confused with her own unexpected presence. She opened her mouth to correct him, to explain the truth of her situation, but the words would not come. Fear held her tongue, fear of what would happen if she admitted the truth, fear of being thrown back out into the cold with nothing, fear that had followed her through every mile of her long walk the previous night. Instead, she found herself nodding, murmuring a quiet thank you, allowing the misunderstanding to stand uncorrected. The Duke, satisfied with her response and eager to return to the pressing matters awaiting him in his study, gave a brief nod and departed as quickly as he had arrived, leaving Alina alone with Margaret, whose face had gone pale with confusion and concern. Margaret did not know what to make of the exchange she had just witnessed, but she knew better than to question her employer's instructions once they had been given. She led Alina upstairs to a guest room far grander than anything Alina had ever seen, a room with a soft bed, tall windows overlooking manicured gardens, and a wardrobe filled with fine dresses left behind by a distant relative who had once stayed at the estate. As the door closed behind Margaret, leaving her alone in this beautiful, unfamiliar room, Alina sat down on the edge of the bed and allowed herself, for the first time in many hours, to cry. She cried from exhaustion, from fear, from grief over the family who had abandoned her, and from the strange, dizzying realization that she had just stepped into a lie so large that she had no idea how she would ever find her way out of it. But beneath the fear, something else stirred inside her, something she barely recognized after the cruelty of the previous night. It was hope, fragile and uncertain, but present nonetheless. For now at least she had warmth, shelter, and a roof over her head. For now she would allow herself this small mercy, even if she knew deep down that the truth could not stay hidden forever, and that when it finally emerged, the consequences might be more severe than anything she had yet imagined. She looked out the window at the gardens below, still glistening with the last traces of the storm, and wondered how long she could keep pretending to be someone she was not. She wondered what kind of man this Duke truly was beneath his cold and hurried exterior. And she wondered, with a mixture of dread and something she could not quite name, what would happen when he finally discovered the truth about the woman he had welcomed into his home. A sharp knock at the door pulled Alina from her thoughts before she had even decided what to do next, and her heart slammed against her ribs as she quickly wiped the tears from her face. She had barely settled into the strange room, barely begun to process the impossible situation she now found herself trapped inside, and already someone was demanding her attention. It was Margaret again, though her expression had changed since their last exchange. Gone was the confusion from earlier. In its place was a brisk, business-like efficiency that suggested she had decided, for now, to simply follow her orders without further question. She carried an armful of clothing, fine dresses in soft colors, and behind her trailed a younger maid carrying a tray of tea and pastries. Alina stood quickly, smoothing down the borrowed blanket still wrapped around her shoulders, unsure of how to behave in front of these women who believed her to be a guest of importance. Margaret instructed her to bathe and dress before the midday meal, explaining that Lady Beatrice, the Duke's younger sister, would be eager to meet her properly, having heard so much about her from the letters exchanged before her arrival. The mention of letters sent a fresh wave of panic through Alina. She realized with growing horror that this misunderstanding was not a small or simple thing. Someone named Caroline Hastings had been expected, someone whose arrival had been planned and discussed for weeks, someone whose absence would eventually be noticed by people who knew her, people who might arrive at any moment and expose the entire deception. She wanted to explain everything, to tell Margaret the truth before the situation grew any more complicated, but something held her back. Perhaps it was fear of the consequences, of being thrown back into the storm with nothing. Perhaps it was simple exhaustion, a desperate need for even a single day of warmth and safety before she faced the world again. Whatever the reason, she said nothing, and allowed herself to be led toward a private bathing room where hot water had already been prepared. As she washed away the grime and cold of the previous night, Alina tried to gather her thoughts. She needed a plan. She could not simply continue pretending to be someone else indefinitely. The truth would surface eventually, and the longer she waited to reveal it herself, the worse the consequences would likely become. But for now, she told herself she would take things one step at a time. She would attend this midday meal, behave as gracefully as her upbringing had taught her, and use the opportunity to learn more about the household and the people within it. Perhaps, she thought, she could find a quiet moment to speak privately with someone, to explain her situation honestly and ask for their discretion and understanding. Dressed in a simple but elegant gown of pale green, her hair carefully arranged by the young maid who had been assigned to assist her, Alina made her way downstairs to the dining room, following Margaret's directions through unfamiliar corridors lined with paintings and polished wood. Her stomach twisted with nerves, but she forced herself to maintain a calm, composed expression, remembering the lessons in poise and etiquette her mother had once taught her, before everything had fallen apart. Lady Beatrice was already seated at the long table when Alina entered, and she rose immediately with a bright, welcoming smile that caught Alina entirely off guard. She was younger than Alina had expected, perhaps 18 or 19, with warm eyes and an energetic manner that suggested genuine excitement rather than the polite formality Alina had braced herself for. Beatrice crossed the room and took both of Alina's hands in her own, expressing how thrilled she was that Caroline had finally arrived, how much she had looked forward to this visit after so many months of correspondence, and how eager she was to introduce her to the other guests expected later that week for the house party. Alina forced a smile and murmured appropriate responses, her mind racing to keep pace with the conversation, careful not to reveal any detail that might contradict whatever Beatrice believed she already knew about the real Caroline Hastings. Fortunately, Beatrice did most of the talking, chattering happily about the plans for the coming week, the guests who would arrive, the activities she had organized, and the dresses she hoped to wear. Alina listened carefully, gathering information, nodding at appropriate moments, and steering the conversation gently away whenever it veered too close to topics she could not safely discuss. Midway through the meal, the Duke himself appeared in the doorway, his expression still carrying traces of the frustration from his morning meetings, though it softened slightly upon seeing his sister so animated and pleased. He took his seat at the head of the table, offering Alina a brief, polite nod before turning his attention to the papers he had brought with him, clearly intending to continue working even during the meal. Beatrice scolded him lightly for his lack of manners, insisting that he put away his papers and properly engage with their guest, and to Alina's surprise, he actually complied, setting the documents aside with a faint, reluctant smile that suggested this was a familiar exchange between siblings. He asked Alina a few polite questions about her journey, about her family, about her impressions of the estate, and Alina answered each one carefully, offering vague, general responses designed to avoid revealing anything specific that could later be proven false. She found to her own surprise that the conversation flowed more easily than she had expected. The Duke, despite his reputation for coldness, listened attentively to her responses, occasionally offering a dry, understated observation that revealed a sharper sense of humor than his stern exterior suggested. Alina found herself relaxing slightly, even smiling genuinely at one of his remarks, before catching herself and remembering the precarious nature of her situation. After the meal concluded, Beatrice insisted on giving Alina a tour of the estate, eager to show off the gardens, the library, and the various rooms that made up the sprawling household. Alina accepted gratefully, glad for the opportunity to learn more about her surroundings and to spend time away from the Duke's watchful, assessing gaze, which she found unsettling in ways she did not yet fully understand. The gardens were beautiful, filled with carefully tended flowers and winding pathways that led to a small pond near the edge of the property. Beatrice spoke enthusiastically about her plans for the future, her hopes of eventually marrying someone she truly loved rather than someone chosen simply for wealth or status, and her frustration with her brother's overly cautious approach to matters of the heart, particularly since a painful betrayal he had suffered several years earlier that he refused to discuss with anyone. Alina listened with growing curiosity, wanting to know more about this betrayal that had apparently shaped the Duke's guarded, distant nature, but she did not push the topic, sensing that Beatrice herself did not know the full details. Instead, she focused on enjoying the beauty of the gardens, the fresh air, and the temporary peace of an afternoon free from immediate danger or uncertainty. As evening approached, Alina returned to her room, exhausted but relieved that the day had passed without disaster. She sat by the window, watching the sun set over the gardens, and allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection. She thought about her family, about the cruelty of their rejection, and felt a fresh wave of anger mixed with sorrow. She thought about the Duke, about the strange kindness hidden beneath his brusque exterior, and felt a confusing flutter of curiosity she could not quite explain. She knew this arrangement could not last. Someone would eventually recognize her, or the real Caroline Hastings would arrive, or some other unforeseen circumstance would expose the truth. But for tonight, at least, she allowed herself to feel safe, warm, and cautiously hopeful, even as a small voice in the back of her mind warned her that such peace rarely lasted long, especially for someone whose entire presence in this grand house was built upon a lie she had not yet found the courage to correct. Later that night, unable to sleep, Alina wandered quietly through the halls, drawn by the soft glow of candlelight coming from a room near the end of the corridor. She found the Duke there, alone in his study, surrounded by papers and ledgers, his expression tired and troubled in a way that suggested burdens far heavier than simple business matters. She hesitated in the doorway, unsure whether to announce her presence or retreat quietly back to her room. Before she could decide, he looked up and noticed her standing there, and for a brief, unguarded moment, something vulnerable flickered across his face before he quickly composed himself. He asked if something had disturbed her sleep, and Alina, caught off guard by the unexpected softness in his tone, found herself stepping into the room and admitting, in a rare moment of honesty, that she often struggled to sleep when her mind was troubled by difficult thoughts. He nodded slowly, as though he understood exactly what she meant, and gestured toward a chair near his desk, inviting her to sit if she wished. Alina accepted, and for the next hour the two of them talked quietly about nothing of great importance, avoiding any topic too personal or revealing, yet somehow finding a strange, unexpected comfort in each other's company. Neither of them spoke of the secrets they carried, but something had shifted between them that night, something neither was yet ready to name, and Alina left the study feeling more confused and more drawn to this guarded, complicated man than she had any right to feel given the fragile lie upon which her entire presence in his home depended. A carriage rolled up the long gravel drive just after breakfast 3 days later, and the sound of its wheels sent a jolt of alarm through Alina before she even understood why. She had grown almost comfortable in her new routine, walking the gardens with Beatrice each morning, sharing quiet conversations with the Duke in the evenings, allowing herself to believe, foolishly, that the lie might hold a little longer. The sight of that carriage shattered any such illusion in an instant. Beatrice rushed to the window with excitement, announcing that more guests had arrived early for the house party, and Alina's stomach dropped as she watched two figures step down from the carriage, a middle-aged woman in an elegant traveling coat and a younger man who greeted the household staff with easy familiarity. Beatrice identified them immediately as Lord and Lady Farrington, close friends of the family who had known Alina's supposed identity, Caroline Hastings, since childhood. Alina's mind raced through possibilities, each worse than the last. If these guests had known the real Caroline for years, they would recognize immediately that Alina was not who she claimed to be. She considered feigning illness, retreating to her room and avoiding the guests entirely, but she knew such a strategy could only delay the inevitable, not prevent it. Beatrice was already moving toward the entrance hall, eager to introduce her new friend to the newly arrived guests, and Alina had no choice but to follow, her heart pounding with dread. The introduction happened quickly in the grand entrance hall, with Beatrice practically glowing with excitement as she presented Alina to Lady Farrington. Alina held her breath, waiting for the moment of recognition, the gasp of confusion, the accusation that would end everything, but it never came. Lady Farrington studied her for a moment with polite curiosity before extending a warm greeting, expressing how pleased she was to finally meet Caroline in person after hearing so much about her through correspondence. Alina nearly collapsed with relief, though she kept her expression carefully composed. She realized, with a strange mixture of relief and unease, that Lady Farrington had apparently never actually met the real Caroline Hastings, having only exchanged letters and heard descriptions second-hand through mutual acquaintances. The danger had not materialized this time, but Alina understood clearly now that she had been granted only a temporary reprieve. Sooner or later, someone who actually knew Caroline would arrive, and no amount of luck would save her from that encounter. The following days passed in a strange blur of tension and unexpected joy. The house filled gradually with more guests arriving for Beatrice's party, each new arrival bringing fresh anxiety as Alina waited to see whether this would be the person who finally exposed her. Yet each time, through some combination of luck and careful evasion, she managed to avoid direct confrontation, deflecting questions about her family and background with vague, practiced responses that revealed little of substance. Meanwhile, her relationship with the Duke continued to deepen in ways that surprised and unsettled her. He sought her out more frequently now, finding excuses to walk with her through the gardens or to invite her opinion on matters he discussed with his sister. Alina noticed the change in him too, the way his guarded expression softened whenever she entered a room, the way he seemed to genuinely value her thoughts rather than simply tolerating her presence as an obligation of hospitality. One afternoon, while the other guests occupied themselves with a game of cards in the drawing room, the Duke invited Alina to join him for a walk to the edge of the estate, where a small stone bridge crossed a gentle stream. The autumn air was crisp and cool, and golden leaves drifted down around them as they walked in comfortable silence, neither feeling the need to fill every moment with conversation. Eventually, the Duke spoke, his voice quieter and more thoughtful than she had heard before. He told her, with obvious difficulty, about the woman he had once planned to marry, a woman who had claimed to love him but had actually been more interested in his wealth and title than in him as a person. She had betrayed his trust in ways he still found painful to discuss, and the experience had left him deeply wary of forming close attachments, particularly with anyone whose intentions he could not fully verify. Elinor listened with a growing sense of guilt she could not shake. Here was a man opening himself up to her, sharing his deepest wounds, while she continued to hide the most fundamental truth about herself, a lie that grew heavier with every passing day. She wanted desperately to confess everything in that moment, to tell him the truth about who she really was and why she had allowed this misunderstanding to continue for so long. But fear held her back once again, fear that his newfound trust would shatter instantly upon learning the extent of her deception, fear that she would lose not only her current safety, but also the growing warmth she felt developing between them. Instead, she offered him quiet words of comfort, acknowledging the pain of his experience without judgment, and gently suggested that not everyone who entered his life intended to deceive or harm him. The words felt hollow even as she spoke them, given her own circumstances, but the Duke seemed to find genuine comfort in her response, his expression softening further as he looked at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. They stood together on the small stone bridge as the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, simply existing together in a silence that felt charged with unspoken emotion. Elinor felt something shift inside her chest, a warmth and longing she had never experienced before, and she suspected, from the way the Duke was looking at her, that he felt something similar. He reached out slowly and took her hand, his fingers warm against her own, and asked quietly whether she had felt, as he had, that their connection over these past days had grown into something deeper than simple friendship. Elinor's heart raced, torn between the overwhelming desire to admit her true feelings and the crushing weight of the secret she continued to carry. She managed only a small nod, unable to trust her voice, and the Duke's expression brightened with a rare, genuine smile that transformed his usually stern features entirely. They returned to the house as darkness fell, walking slightly closer together than they had on their way out, though neither spoke openly about what had passed between them on that bridge. Elinor retreated to her room that night with her emotions in complete disarray, torn between happiness she had never expected to feel again and guilt that grew heavier with every hour she continued to deceive the man who had begun to trust her so completely. She sat by her window long into the night, staring out at the darkened gardens, wrestling with an impossible decision. She could continue as she had been, enjoying this fragile happiness while it lasted, knowing that discovery could come at any moment and destroy everything. Or she could find the courage to confess the truth herself, before someone else revealed it for her, risking immediate rejection, but perhaps preserving some small chance of forgiveness through honesty rather than continued deception. She resolved, finally, as exhaustion began to overtake her, that she would find a way to tell him the truth soon, perhaps after the house party concluded and the risk of public exposure diminished slightly. It was a compromise born of fear rather than courage, she knew, but it was the only plan she could manage to construct in her current state of emotional turmoil. She fell asleep still uncertain whether this plan would prove wise or whether she was simply delaying an inevitable disaster that grew more catastrophic with every day she allowed the lie to continue. What she did not know, as she drifted into uneasy sleep, was that events already set into motion elsewhere would soon take the decision entirely out of her hands, and that the truth she feared to reveal herself would soon be exposed in a manner far more painful and public than anything she could have imagined. A letter arrived the following morning that would set everything in motion, though Elinor had no idea of its existence until it was far too late to prepare herself for the consequences. Beatrice, sorting through the household correspondence over breakfast, let out a small gasp of surprise as she read a note from a family friend who had written to express her disappointment at missing the opportunity to see Caroline Hastings during her visit, having heard secondhand that Caroline had been forced to cancel her travel plans entirely due to a sudden illness that had kept her confined to her family's estate for the past several weeks. The words hung in the air of the dining room like a physical weight, and Elinor felt the blood drain from her face as she realized what this meant. If Caroline Hastings had genuinely been unable to travel due to illness, Then the entire foundation of the misunderstanding that had brought Alina into this household made even less sense than she had originally assumed, and the truth of her deception would now become impossible to hide from anyone with even passing knowledge of the real Caroline's circumstances. Beatrice, initially confused by the contradiction, looked up with a puzzled expression and asked Alina directly whether she had perhaps recovered from an illness before deciding to travel after all, offering a reasonable explanation that Alina could have easily accepted to smooth over the confusion. But something inside Alina, perhaps exhaustion from carrying this secret for so long, perhaps a genuine desire to finally end the deception before it grew any larger, made her hesitate rather than immediately agreeing with the convenient excuse. Her hesitation lasted only a moment, but it was enough for Beatrice's sharp intelligence to notice something amiss. The young woman's expression shifted from confusion to genuine concern, and she asked more directly whether something was wrong, whether Alina had something she needed to share. Alina's heart pounded as she glanced around the dining room, relieved that the Duke had not yet joined them for breakfast, though she knew this reprieve would not last long. She asked Beatrice in a quiet, trembling voice whether they might speak privately, away from the other guests who had begun filtering into the room for the morning meal. Beatrice agreed immediately, sensing the seriousness in Alina's tone, and led her to a small private sitting room away from curious ears, her earlier warmth now tinged with visible worry about what she was about to hear. Once the door closed behind them, Alina found that the words she had rehearsed so many times in her mind refused to come easily. She stumbled through an explanation, her voice breaking as she described the storm, her collapse near the gate, the Duke's mistaken assumption about her identity, and her own desperate, fearful decision to allow the misunderstanding to continue rather than face being cast back out into the world with nothing. Beatrice listened in stunned silence, her expression cycling through shock, confusion, and something that looked dangerously close to betrayal. When Alina finally finished her confession, tears streaming freely down her face, Beatrice remained quiet for a long, agonizing moment before speaking, her voice tight with hurt and disappointment. She had genuinely believed, she said, that they had become friends over these past days, that the connection between them had been real and meaningful. Now she did not know what to believe, whether any of their conversations, any of the trust she had extended, had meant anything at all to someone who had been lying about her fundamental identity the entire time. Alina tried to explain that her feelings, her gratitude, her growing affection for both Beatrice and the Duke had been entirely genuine, that only her name and circumstances had been false, but the distinction felt weak even as she offered it. Before Alina could say anything more, the door opened, and the Duke himself stepped into the room, having noticed his sister's absence from breakfast and grown concerned enough to search for her. He took one look at both women's tear-streaked faces and immediately understood that something serious had occurred, though he had no idea yet of the magnitude of what he was about to learn. Beatrice, still reeling from her own hurt and confusion, did not have the composure to soften the revelation for her brother's benefit. She told him directly, without preamble, that the woman he had welcomed into their home, the woman he had grown so close to over these past days, was not Caroline Hastings at all, but a stranger who had allowed them to believe a lie for her own benefit and survival. The Duke's expression transformed in an instant, the warmth and openness Alina had come to recognize over their recent conversations hardening into something cold and distant, a wall snapping back into place with frightening speed. He turned to Alina, his eyes searching her face as though seeing her for the first time, and asked, his voice dangerously quiet, whether what his sister had just said was true. Alina could not deny it, though every instinct told her to try. She nodded slowly, her voice barely above a whisper as she attempted to explain the circumstances that had led to her deception, the desperation of her situation, the fear that had prevented her from correcting the misunderstanding sooner. But the Duke's expression remained unmoved, his jaw tight, his hands clenched at his sides as old wounds from his previous betrayal clearly resurfaced with painful clarity. He interrupted her explanation before she could finish, his voice sharp with an anger that seemed to encompass both this fresh betrayal and the lingering pain of his past experience. He accused her of manipulation, of exploiting his hospitality and his trust for her own gain, of allowing him to believe in a connection that had apparently been built entirely on false pretenses. Alina tried desperately to explain that her feelings for him had been real, that she had never intended to hurt him or exploit his kindness, but he refused to listen, his mind already made up. He called for Margaret and instructed her, in a voice devoid of any warmth, to have Eleanor's belongings gathered immediately and to arrange for her removal from the estate within the hour. Eleanor pleaded with him, tears streaming down her face, begging for the opportunity to properly explain herself, to make him understand the impossible position she had found herself in that stormy night. But he would not hear it, turning away from her and leaving the room without another word, his back rigid with barely controlled fury. Beatrice, despite her own hurt feelings, seemed to soften slightly upon seeing Eleanor's genuine distress, but she did not intervene on her behalf, still too confused, and betrayed herself to know what course of action would be right. Margaret arrived shortly after, her expression carefully neutral, as she informed Eleanor that a carriage would be arranged to take her wherever she wished to go, though the offer felt more like banishment than kindness given the circumstances. Eleanor packed her few belongings with trembling hands, the fine dresses she had worn during her stay left behind, replaced by the simple worn clothing she had arrived in that stormy night. She looked around the beautiful guest room one final time, remembering the brief happiness she had experienced within these walls, the warmth of the fire, the comfort of safety, the growing affection she had felt developing with a man who now looked at her with nothing but contempt and betrayal. As she descended the grand staircase for the final time, she caught a brief glimpse of the Duke standing in his study, his back turned toward the hallway, refusing even to watch her departure. The sight broke something inside her, and she left the estate with tears streaming down her face, climbing into the carriage that would carry her back into the uncertain world she had briefly escaped, with even less than she had possessed upon her arrival, having lost not only her temporary shelter, but also the fragile hope of happiness that had begun to bloom within her heart during her short time in that grand house. The carriage rolled away from the estate as rain began to fall once again, an unwelcome echo of the storm that had first brought her to this place, and Eleanor watched through the small window as the grand house grew smaller in the distance, disappearing eventually behind the curve of the road, taking with it any hope she had allowed herself to feel over these past several days. She did not know where the carriage was taking her, having given the driver no specific destination in her distress, and she found, in that moment, that she did not particularly care. Nothing awaited her anywhere in the world except uncertainty, and she felt too exhausted, too heartbroken, to summon the energy to worry about what would come next. The carriage driver, a kind man named George who had overheard enough of the commotion at the estate to guess that something painful had occurred, finally asked Eleanor gently where she wished to be taken, since she had said nothing since climbing aboard. Eleanor stared blankly out the window for a long moment before admitting, in a hollow voice, that she had nowhere to go. George considered this for a moment before offering, without judgment, to take her to a modest but respectable part of the city, where she might find a room to rent for whatever small amount of money she still possessed. She thanked him quietly, grateful for even this small kindness in the midst of her despair, and settled back into the seat as the carriage rolled through the streets of London, moving further from the grand estate and deeper into the ordinary, struggling world she had briefly escaped. By the time they arrived at a narrow street lined with modest houses, evening had begun to settle over the city, and Eleanor climbed down from the carriage with her small bag clutched tightly against her chest, the last of her coins ready to be spent on whatever shelter she could find. Her search proved more difficult than she had hoped. Several landlords turned her away upon learning she had no family references, no proof of steady income, and only a handful of coins to offer. Desperation began creeping back into her chest as darkness fell and the temperature dropped, memories of that terrible night in the storm returning with painful clarity. She was beginning to fear that she would once again find herself without shelter when she knocked on the door of a small, weathered house at the end of the street, more out of exhaustion than genuine hope. The door was opened by an elderly woman with kind eyes and silver hair pulled back into a simple bun. Her name was Margaret Colby, though she quickly insisted that Eleanor call her simply by her first name, and something about her gentle, weathered face made Eleanor feel, for the first time since leaving the estate, that perhaps she had found someone who might genuinely help her rather than simply tolerate her presence for profit. The woman listened patiently as Eleanor explained her situation, offering only a general account of hardship and homelessness without revealing the full complicated truth of recent events, and to Eleanor's immense relief and gratitude, the widow agreed to let her stay in a small spare room in exchange for help with household chores, since she lived alone and had long struggled to manage the physical demands of maintaining her small home. The room was tiny and sparsely furnished, nothing like the grand guest chamber she had briefly occupied at the Duke's estate, but it was clean, dry, and safe, and Alina felt an overwhelming rush of gratitude as she finally allowed herself to rest that night, exhausted both physically and emotionally from the events of the day. She lay awake for a long time, staring at the cracked ceiling above her narrow bed, replaying the painful scene from that morning over and over in her mind, the Duke's cold expression, his refusal to listen, his harsh accusations that had cut deeper than she wanted to admit. The following weeks settled into a difficult but manageable routine. Alina helped Margaret Colby with cooking, cleaning, and mending clothes, tasks that kept her hands busy even as her mind remained consumed with thoughts of the life she had briefly glimpsed and lost. She thought often of Beatrice's initial warmth, now curdled into hurt confusion, and even more often of the Duke himself, of the brief moment on the stone bridge when he had reached for her hand and asked whether she felt what he felt before everything had shattered so completely. She tried to convince herself that it was better this way, that continuing the deception would only have led to greater pain eventually, that at least now the truth had been revealed before her feelings had grown even deeper. But these rationalizations did little to ease the ache in her chest each time she remembered the coldness in his eyes as he ordered her removal from his home, or the way he had refused even to look at her during her final moments in that grand house. Margaret Colby, perceptive despite her age, noticed the sadness that clung to her young houseguest and gently encouraged her to speak of it, though she never pressed too hard when Alina deflected with vague responses about difficult family circumstances. The older woman's kindness provided a steady source of comfort during this difficult period, and Alina found herself growing genuinely fond of her, grateful for the simple companionship and quiet understanding that asked for nothing in return except honest effort and mutual respect. As autumn deepened into the colder months, Alina began searching for more permanent employment, hoping to eventually earn enough to support herself independently rather than relying entirely on Margaret Colby's generosity. She applied for positions as a seamstress, a governess, and a shop assistant, drawing on the education and skills her family had once provided before their fall from grace, but opportunities proved scarce, and the competition for even modest positions was fierce among the many young women in similar circumstances throughout the city. The physical toll of her recent hardships, combined with the emotional weight of her heartbreak, began to affect her health as the weather grew colder. She caught a persistent cough that refused to fully clear, and her already thin frame grew thinner still as appetite abandoned her during her lowest moments of despair. Margaret Colby fretted over her, insisting she rest more and eat properly, but Alina felt a stubborn need to remain useful, to earn her place in this small household rather than becoming another burden for someone who had already shown her such generous kindness. One particularly cold evening, as Alina sat by the small fire mending one of Margaret's old dresses, her hands trembling slightly from a combination of cold and exhaustion, she allowed herself, for the first time since leaving the estate, to truly grieve everything she had lost. Not just the comfort and safety of the Duke's grand house, but the family who had abandoned her so cruelly, the future she had once imagined for herself before poverty and betrayal had reshaped her entire existence, and the brief, precious connection she had shared with a man who now believed her nothing more than a manipulative liar. She wondered, in her quieter moments, whether the Duke ever thought of her at all, whether any part of him regretted the harsh manner in which he had cast her from his home, or whether he had simply moved forward with his life, his brief interest in her erased entirely by the revelation of her deception. She told herself it did not matter, that she needed to focus on rebuilding her own life rather than dwelling on a connection that had never truly belonged to her in the first place, built as it was upon a foundation of lies she had chosen not to correct. But even as she tried to convince herself of this practical wisdom, some small, stubborn part of her heart continued to hope, foolishly perhaps, that the story between them was not yet finished, that somewhere beneath his anger and hurt pride, the man who had reached for her hand on that stone bridge still existed, and that perhaps someday circumstances might allow the truth of her feelings, if not her name, to finally be understood and forgiven. A heavy silence had settled over the Duke's estate in the weeks following Alina's departure, and even the staff, normally accustomed to their employer's reserved manner, noticed a difference in his demeanor that went beyond his usual seriousness. He spent longer hours locked away in his study, emerging only for necessary meals, and even those he often took in silence, his mind clearly occupied with thoughts he refused to share with anyone. Beatrice, still processing her own complicated feelings about the deception, found herself increasingly troubled by her brother's behavior. She had expected his anger to fade with time, as it usually did with lesser frustrations, but instead it seemed to have transformed into something quieter and more persistent, a brooding heaviness that colored every interaction she attempted to have with him. She began to wonder, despite her own lingering hurt over Alina's dishonesty, whether her brother's reaction had been driven by something deeper than simple outrage at being deceived. She approached him one evening in his study, finding him staring blankly at a ledger he had clearly not been reading, his quill resting untouched beside a half-filled page. She asked him directly whether he regretted the harsh manner in which he had dismissed Alina from their home, and his immediate, defensive denial felt unconvincing even to himself, judging by the way his shoulders tensed and his gaze dropped back to the papers before him. Beatrice pressed gently, reminding him of the genuine warmth she had witnessed between them during Alina's stay, the way his entire demeanor had softened whenever she entered a room, the obvious affection that had seemed to grow between them despite his usual guardedness with new acquaintances. She acknowledged her own hurt feelings about the deception, but admitted that upon further reflection, she found herself troubled by the desperate circumstances Alina had described, circumstances that suggested cruelty and abandonment rather than calculated manipulation. The Duke remained quiet for a long moment, his jaw tight with the effort of maintaining his composed exterior, before finally admitting, in a voice barely above a whisper, that he had not been able to stop thinking about her since her departure. He confessed that his anger, while genuine, had perhaps been amplified by echoes of his past betrayal, by old wounds that had made him unable to extend the grace or understanding that the situation might have actually warranted. He acknowledged, with visible difficulty, that he had refused to even hear her explanation before ordering her removal, a decision that now, in the quiet aftermath, struck him as perhaps unnecessarily harsh. Beatrice, sensing an opening, gently suggested that perhaps they should learn more about the true circumstances that had led Alina to their doorstep that stormy night, rather than simply assuming the worst about her intentions. The Duke resisted this suggestion initially, pride and lingering hurt making him reluctant to reconsider his judgment, but Beatrice's words seemed to plant a seed of doubt that continued to grow in the following days, manifesting in increasingly restless nights and distracted mornings that his household staff noticed with quiet concern. Meanwhile, his business partner, a shrewd and observant man named Charles Winters, arrived for a previously scheduled meeting regarding their ongoing venture and immediately noticed the change in his friend's demeanor. Over the course of their discussion, which the Duke struggled to focus on despite his usual sharp attention to financial matters, Charles finally asked directly what had been troubling him so visibly in recent weeks. The Duke, uncharacteristically, found himself confiding in his friend about the entire situation, the mysterious young woman who had arrived during the storm, the mistaken identity that had led to weeks of growing closeness, and the painful revelation that had ended everything so abruptly. Charles listened with genuine interest, and when the Duke finished his account, he asked a simple but pointed question that struck the Duke with unexpected force. Had he actually verified the details of Caroline Hastings' supposed illness and cancellation, or had he simply accepted his sister's second-hand information without further investigation? The question lingered in the Duke's mind long after Charles departed, and that evening, unable to shake his growing unease, he retrieved the correspondence his household had exchanged regarding the original invitation to Caroline Hastings, searching through the letters with a methodical thoroughness he usually reserved for business matters. What he found troubled him deeply. The invitation had been extended weeks before Alina's arrival, but the confirmation of Caroline's actual travel plans had never been properly received, lost somewhere in the confusion of his busy schedule and his sister's excited planning for the house party. He realized, with a sinking feeling in his stomach, that he had never actually verified whether the young woman who arrived that stormy night was truly the guest he expected, having simply assumed her identity based on the timing of her arrival and his own distracted, hurried state of mind. The mistake, he now understood with painful clarity, had originated entirely with his own careless assumption, not with any deliberate deception on Alina's part in those initial crucial moments. She had simply failed to correct an error that he himself had made, out of fear and desperation rather than calculated manipulation. This realization did not entirely absolve her in his mind of the choice she had made to continue the deception over the following days rather than confessing immediately, but it fundamentally altered his understanding of how the entire situation had begun, and it forced him to confront the possibility that his harsh, immediate judgment of her character might have been unfair, colored more by his own past wounds than by the actual circumstances she had described. He spent that night pacing his study, wrestling with conflicting emotions, anger at himself for his role in creating the initial confusion, lingering hurt over feeling deceived, and a growing, undeniable ache of longing for the woman whose presence had brought unexpected warmth into his carefully guarded life. He thought of her laughter during their walks in the garden, her quiet wisdom during their late-night conversations in his study, the way she had looked at him on the stone bridge when he had reached for her hand, and he found himself, for the first time since her departure, genuinely wondering where she was now and whether she was safe. The following morning, he summoned Margaret to his study and asked her directly whether she knew anything about where Elinor might have gone after leaving the estate. Margaret admitted she had arranged for a carriage, but had not thought to ask the young woman's specific destination, given the emotional turmoil of that difficult morning. The Duke's frustration at this lack of information only intensified his growing sense of urgency, and he found himself, for the first time in years, genuinely uncertain about how to proceed, torn between his lingering pride and an increasingly powerful need to find her, to hear her full explanation, and to determine whether the connection he had felt during those brief weeks together had been as genuine as his heart now insisted it must have been. Elinor collapsed onto the kitchen floor without warning one cold morning, the wooden spoon she had been holding clattering loudly against the stone tiles as her vision blurred and her legs gave way beneath her. Margaret Colby, working nearby, rushed to her side with a cry of alarm, catching her before her head could strike the hard floor, and calling desperately for the neighbor's son to fetch a doctor as quickly as his legs could carry him. The weeks of insufficient food, persistent cold, and unrelenting emotional strain had finally taken their toll on Elinor's already weakened body. The cough that had lingered for weeks had worsened considerably in recent days, developing into something more serious that left her breathless after even minor exertion, though she had continued to hide the severity of her symptoms from Margaret Colby, not wanting to burden the kind widow with additional worry or expense. The doctor arrived within the hour, a serious young man who examined Elinor with careful attention while she drifted in and out of feverish awareness on a makeshift bed near the fire. His diagnosis was grave. Her lungs had become seriously congested, likely from prolonged exposure to cold and damp conditions combined with inadequate nourishment, and he warned that without proper rest, warmth, and medicine, her condition could deteriorate significantly further, potentially threatening her life entirely. Margaret Colby, despite her limited means, insisted on purchasing whatever medicine the doctor recommended, using savings she had carefully set aside for her own future needs. She sat vigil beside Elinor's bed through the following days, applying cool cloths to her fevered brow, coaxing small amounts of broth past her cracked lips, and murmuring quiet words of encouragement even when Elinor remained too weak or unconscious to respond. During her feverish delirium, Elinor spoke often of things that made little sense to Margaret Colby, fragments of memory that surfaced and dissolved as quickly as they appeared. She spoke of storms and slammed doors, of a beautiful garden with a stone bridge, of a voice that had once asked her a question she had been too afraid to fully answer. Margaret listened to these fragmented ramblings with growing curiosity about the young woman's mysterious past, though she never pressed for explanations, focusing instead on nursing her back to health with whatever limited resources she possessed. 3 days passed in this precarious state, with Elinor's fever refusing to fully break despite Margaret's dedicated care. The doctor returned twice more, his expression growing increasingly concerned with each visit, and he gently suggested that Margaret Colby should perhaps prepare herself for the possibility that the young woman's condition might not improve, that sometimes, despite everyone's best efforts, illness proved stronger than the human body's ability to recover, particularly when that body had already been weakened by prolonged hardship and grief. Margaret refused to accept such a grim prognosis, continuing her vigilant care with stubborn determination, refusing to leave Elinor's bedside except for the briefest necessary moments. She spoke to her constantly, even when Elinor showed no sign of hearing her words, telling her stories from her own long life, describing the small joys and simple pleasures that still awaited her should she find the strength to recover, and insisting with quiet but fierce conviction that whatever pain had brought her to this point, her story was not yet finished. On the fourth night, as a particularly harsh fever gripped Eleanor's body, causing her to thrash weakly against her thin blankets and mutter incoherent pleas that broke Margaret's heart to witness, something finally shifted. Near dawn, her fever broke, drenching her thin nightgown in sweat but leaving her breathing noticeably easier than it had been in days. Margaret wept with relief as she changed the damp sheets and helped Eleanor into dry clothing, watching as her young charge finally settled into a deeper, more peaceful sleep than she had managed since her collapse. Eleanor woke the following afternoon, weak and disoriented, but lucid for the first time in days, her eyes finding Margaret's exhausted but relieved face hovering nearby. She struggled to speak, her voice raspy and barely audible, but managed to express her gratitude for the older woman's care, tears filling her eyes as she realized the extent of the sacrifice Margaret had made on her behalf, spending precious savings and countless hours of exhausting vigilance to nurse a stranger back to health with no expectation of reward beyond simple human kindness. Margaret waved away her thanks with characteristic modesty, insisting that anyone would have done the same, though both women knew this was not entirely true given the harsh realities of the world they inhabited. She helped Eleanor sip a small amount of broth, still concerned about her continued weakness, and gently suggested that perhaps now, with her strength slowly beginning to return, Eleanor might feel ready to share more about the circumstances that had brought such deep sorrow and hardship into her young life. Eleanor, weakened both physically and emotionally by her recent brush with death, finally found herself unable to maintain the careful reserve she had held onto for so many weeks. She told Margaret everything, from her family's cruel abandonment to the storm that had brought her to the Duke's estate, from the mistaken identity that had led to weeks of unexpected happiness to the devastating discovery and harsh dismissal that had followed. She spoke of her growing feelings for the Duke, feelings she had tried desperately to suppress given the impossible circumstances of their connection, and the crushing heartbreak of watching those feelings apparently mean nothing to him in the face of her deception. Margaret listened with quiet compassion, offering no judgment for the choices Eleanor had made under such desperate circumstances, only gentle understanding for the impossible position fear and survival had forced upon her. She gently suggested, once Eleanor finished her account, that perhaps the Duke's harsh reaction had said more about his own unresolved wounds than about any genuine failing on Eleanor's part, and that sometimes people needed time and distance before they could see situations with greater clarity and fairness than their initial emotional reactions allowed. Eleanor appreciated the kind words, though she remained doubtful that any amount of time or reflection would soften the Duke's judgment of her, given the finality of his expression and the coldness in his voice during those final devastating moments at his estate. She resolved, as her strength slowly began returning over the following days, that she would focus entirely on rebuilding her own independent life, setting aside any lingering hope for reconciliation that she now considered nothing more than a foolish, painful fantasy unworthy of further emotional investment. What she did not know, resting quietly in that small, humble room, was that many miles away, the very man she had resolved to forget had already begun a determined search to find her, driven by a growing certainty that he could not simply move forward with his life until he had properly made amends for the pain his hasty judgment had caused. The stable master's answer struck the Duke like a physical blow, and he gripped the edge of the doorframe as the man explained that the carriage driver who had taken the young lady away that terrible morning, a man named George, had left the household's employment shortly afterward to work for a different family across the city, making him considerably more difficult to locate than the Duke had originally hoped. Weeks had passed since his conversation with Charles Winters had first planted seeds of doubt about his hasty judgment, weeks during which his determination to find Eleanor had only intensified despite the complete absence of any solid leads regarding her whereabouts. He had exhausted every obvious avenue of inquiry, questioning his household staff repeatedly, sending discreet letters to acquaintances who might have encountered a young woman matching her description, and even personally visiting several charitable institutions that assisted women in difficult circumstances, all without success. The revelation about George's new employment offered the first genuine hope he had encountered in his frustrating search, and he immediately dispatched a servant to inquire throughout the city about which household might have recently hired a carriage driver of that name. The search took several more days, requiring patience that tested the Duke's already strained nerves. But eventually his servant returned with promising information, having located a household in a modest but respectable part of the city that employed a driver matching the description. The Duke traveled there himself rather than sending an intermediary, unable to bear the thought of delegating something so personally important to anyone else. He found George tending to the horses in a small stable behind the house, and the driver's expression shifted from polite confusion to cautious recognition as the Duke explained his purpose, asking urgently whether George remembered the young woman he had transported from the estate several weeks earlier and whether he could recall where he had ultimately taken her. George hesitated for a moment, clearly recalling the emotional distress of that particular journey and feeling some protective instinct toward the young woman he had helped that day. But something in the Duke's evident sincerity and obvious concern eventually convinced him to share what he remembered, describing the street where he had left her searching for lodging, though he admitted he had not witnessed which specific house she had ultimately entered. Armed with this partial information, the Duke returned to his own carriage and directed his driver toward the neighborhood George had described, his heart pounding with a mixture of hope and anxiety as they navigated through increasingly modest streets, farther from the grand estates and fashionable districts he typically frequented. He instructed his driver to proceed slowly, his eyes scanning each house they passed, as though he might somehow recognize Eleanor's presence through sheer force of determination alone. The search proved more difficult than he had anticipated. The neighborhood contained dozens of similar modest houses, and he had no way of knowing which one, if any, had opened its doors to a desperate young woman seeking shelter weeks earlier. He began knocking on doors himself, ignoring the curious and sometimes suspicious looks from residents unaccustomed to seeing a nobleman personally canvassing their humble street, asking each person whether they knew anything about a young woman who might have arrived in the area around the time in question. Most doors yielded nothing but confused shakes of the head or polite apologies for being unable to help. The Duke's initial determination began giving way to frustrated despair as he worked his way down the street with no success, wondering whether Eleanor had perhaps moved on entirely from this neighborhood, taking whatever fragile trail he had managed to follow with her into complete obscurity. Just as the afternoon light began fading, and he considered whether he would need to return the following day to continue his search, he knocked on the door of a small, weathered house at the end of the street, more out of thoroughness than genuine remaining hope. The door was opened by an elderly woman with kind, tired eyes who studied him with obvious surprise at finding such an obviously wealthy and well-dressed man standing on her humble doorstep. The Duke asked his now familiar question, describing Eleanor's appearance and the approximate timing of her arrival in the neighborhood, and something in the older woman's expression shifted immediately from polite confusion to sharp, protective wariness. She asked cautiously why he was searching for the young woman, and the Duke, recognizing the significance of her reaction, felt his heart leap with sudden, overwhelming hope even as he struggled to formulate an honest, complete answer to her understandable question. He explained as concisely as he could manage while standing on her doorstep in the fading light, that he was the Duke from whose estate Eleanor had departed weeks earlier, that he had made a terrible mistake in judging her too harshly and too quickly, and that he had come to find her, to properly hear her explanation, and to make whatever amends might still be possible for the pain his hasty actions had caused her. Margaret Colby studied him carefully throughout this explanation, her expression difficult to read, clearly weighing whether to trust this unexpected and unusual visitor with information about the vulnerable young woman she had come to care for so deeply over these past weeks. Finally she spoke, her voice carrying a note of protective warning that the Duke understood and respected completely, informing him that Eleanor had indeed been staying in her home, but that she had recently suffered a serious illness that had nearly claimed her life, and that she remained fragile, both physically and emotionally, from everything she had endured. The Duke's breath caught at this information, guilt and fear washing over him in equal measure, as he considered how close he might have come to losing the opportunity to properly apologize, to explain his own realization about the mistake that had originated with his own careless assumption rather than any deliberate deception on Eleanor's part. He asked, his voice tight with emotion he rarely allowed himself to display so openly, whether he might be permitted to see her, to speak with her, even briefly, promising that he intended no further harm and sought only the chance to properly make amends. Margaret Colby hesitated for a long moment, her protective instincts warring with her genuine desire to see Alina find some resolution to the sorrow that had clearly weighed so heavily upon her young heart throughout her recovery. Finally, she stepped back from the doorway, gesturing him inside with cautious permission, though she warned him firmly that she would not tolerate any further cruelty toward the young woman who had become like a daughter to her during these difficult weeks. The Duke nodded solemnly, understanding completely the weight of the responsibility he now carried, and followed her into the modest house, his heart pounding with a mixture of hope, fear, and determination as he prepared to face the woman whose forgiveness he had traveled across the city desperately hoping to earn. Alina's teacup slipped from her fingers and shattered against the floor the moment she looked up and saw the Duke standing in the doorway of the small sitting room, his tall frame seeming to fill the modest space entirely, his expression a mixture of anxiety and determination that she had never before seen on his usually composed features. For a long, frozen moment, neither of them spoke, the shock of the unexpected encounter rendering both of them momentarily speechless. She rose slowly from her chair, her legs still weak from her recent illness, one hand instinctively reaching for the back of the seat to steady herself as a dizzying rush of emotions crashed over her, disbelief, lingering hurt, and despite everything, an unwelcome flutter of hope that she immediately tried to suppress. She asked, her voice trembling slightly, why he had come, what possible purpose could bring him to this humble corner of the city that he clearly had no reason to visit under ordinary circumstances. The Duke stepped further into the room, his own composure clearly strained as he searched for the right words to begin the difficult conversation he had traveled so far to have. He explained, haltingly at first but with growing conviction, that he had discovered the truth about the original invitation extended to Caroline Hastings, that he had realized the mistaken identity had begun entirely with his own careless assumption on that first confusing morning, not with any deliberate scheme on Alina's part to deceive him. Alina listened with guarded skepticism, unwilling to allow herself to hope too quickly given the devastating pain of their previous parting. She reminded him, her voice hardening slightly, that regardless of how the misunderstanding had originated, she had still made the choice to continue the deception for days afterward, allowing him and his sister to believe a falsehood rather than confessing the truth immediately when the opportunity first presented itself. The Duke acknowledged this fully, taking a step closer but stopping himself before crossing into a distance that might feel too presumptuous given the circumstances. He admitted that her choice to continue the deception had been wrong, but he also acknowledged, with visible difficulty, that he now understood the desperate fear that had driven that choice, the terror of being once again cast out into a world that had already shown her such devastating cruelty through her own family's abandonment. He explained that he had spent the weeks since her departure reflecting deeply on his own behavior, recognizing that his harsh, immediate judgment had been colored more by the lingering wounds of his own past betrayal than by any fair assessment of her actual circumstances and character. He had refused in that painful confrontation to even listen to her explanation, choosing instead to protect his own wounded pride rather than extend the understanding and grace that her genuinely difficult situation had deserved. Alina felt tears beginning to gather in her eyes despite her determined effort to maintain her composure, moved by the evident sincerity in his words and the visible emotional cost of this unusually open admission from a man normally so guarded about his inner feelings. But she remained cautious, still uncertain whether his change of heart represented genuine understanding or merely temporary guilt that might fade once the initial emotional intensity of this reunion had passed. She asked him directly, her voice steadier now despite the tears threatening to fall, what exactly he hoped to achieve by finding her, what outcome he envisioned from this unexpected visit to her humble circumstances. The Duke seemed to steady himself at this direct question, taking a deep breath before answering with a clarity and honesty that surprised even himself given his usual reluctance to expose his deepest feelings so openly. He told her that he had missed her more than he had believed possible after such a brief acquaintance, that the weeks since her departure had felt hollow and colorless compared to the warmth and genuine connection he had experienced during their time together, however brief and complicated by circumstances that had shadowed it entirely. He said he had come not merely to apologize, though the apology was certainly owed and sincerely meant, but to ask whether any possibility remained for them to build something real and honest between them, something founded upon truth rather than the confusion and deception that had marked their initial connection. Eleanor's carefully maintained composure finally broke at these words, tears spilling freely down her cheeks as months of accumulated pain, from her family's cruel abandonment through her illness and difficult recovery, finally found release in this unexpected moment of vulnerability and hope. She admitted, through her tears, that she had never stopped thinking of him either, that her feelings during their brief time together had been entirely genuine despite the false name she had carried, and that the pain of his harsh rejection had cut deeper than almost anything else she had endured throughout her difficult recent months. The Duke crossed the remaining distance between them then, unable to maintain his careful restraint any longer, and gently took her trembling hands in his own, his eyes searching her face with an intensity that left no doubt about the sincerity of his feelings. He asked, his voice thick with emotion, whether she might find it possible to forgive him for his harsh judgment and hasty actions, and whether she would consider allowing him the opportunity to properly court her, this time with complete honesty and mutual understanding, as the foundation for whatever future they might build together. Margaret Colby, who had been quietly observing this emotional exchange from the doorway, wiped tears from her own eyes as she witnessed the raw vulnerability and genuine affection passing between these two people, who had each endured such significant pain, before finding their way back to this precious, fragile moment of reconciliation. Eleanor looked up at the Duke through her tears, seeing genuine remorse and hope reflected in his usually guarded eyes, and felt something in her chest finally begin to ease after weeks of carrying such heavy sorrow and disappointment. She did not answer immediately, needing a moment to fully absorb the magnitude of this unexpected reunion and the possibility it represented for a future she had believed entirely lost to her weeks earlier. But as she looked into his face, seeing the sincere vulnerability he rarely allowed himself to display, she felt the last of her carefully constructed defenses beginning to soften, replaced by a cautious but genuine hope that perhaps, despite everything that had happened, their story might yet find a path toward the happiness that had seemed briefly possible during those precious weeks before everything had fallen apart so painfully. 6 months passed in what felt to Eleanor like an entirely different lifetime from the desperate, storm-soaked night, when she had collapsed near the gates of the Duke's estate with nothing but a small bag and a heart full of fear. She stood now in the same gardens where she had once walked with Beatrice during those uncertain early days, though everything about her circumstances had transformed so completely that she sometimes found it difficult to believe this was truly her life, rather than an elaborate dream from which she might wake at any moment. The courtship that followed her reunion with the Duke had unfolded slowly and carefully, both of them determined to build their relationship upon a foundation of complete honesty this time, without the shadows of deception or hidden truths that had complicated their initial connection. The Duke had visited her regularly at Margaret Colby's modest home during her continued recovery, bringing small gifts of fresh fruit and flowers rather than expensive jewelry, understanding instinctively that Eleanor valued genuine thoughtfulness over displays of wealth that might remind her too painfully of the material comforts she had briefly enjoyed and then lost. He had also taken the difficult step of properly investigating and addressing the circumstances of her family's cruel abandonment, using his considerable influence and resources to uncover the full extent of her father's financial ruin and the desperate, misguided decisions that had led to Eleanor's expulsion from her childhood home. Rather than seeking any form of revenge or public humiliation against her family, he had quietly ensured that her father's remaining debts were settled through discreet channels, not as a gift to people who had treated Eleanor so poorly, but as a final closing of that painful chapter, allowing Eleanor to move forward without the lingering financial shadow that might otherwise have followed her into whatever future she chose to build. Beatrice, once she witnessed the genuine transformation in both her brother and Eleanor over these following months, gradually softened her own hurt feelings about the initial deception, coming to understand more fully the desperate circumstances that had shaped Eleanor's difficult choices during that first confused encounter. The two women slowly rebuilt their friendship, this time founded upon complete honesty and mutual understanding, and Beatrice eventually confessed that she had come to think of Eleanor as the sister she had always wished she had, regardless of the complicated circumstances that had first brought them together. Margaret Colby, too, remained a cherished presence in Eleanor's life throughout this transformation, refusing any attempts by the Duke to compensate her financially for her earlier kindness, though she eventually accepted his sincere offer to ensure she never again faced the financial hardships that had made her own life so difficult in her advancing years. Elinor visited her regularly, grateful always for the woman who had nursed her back to health when death had seemed a genuine possibility, and who had offered her shelter and kindness during the darkest weeks of her entire life. The formal proposal, when it finally came, took place not in some grand, elaborate setting designed to impress with wealth and spectacle, but on the same simple stone bridge where the Duke had first reached for her hand months earlier, before everything had fallen apart so painfully. He knelt before her in the golden light of a late afternoon, the autumn leaves once again drifting around them just as they had during that first precious moment of connection, and asked her, with complete sincerity and none of the guarded reserve that had once defined his character, whether she would consent to become his wife, promising to build their future together upon complete honesty, mutual respect, and the genuine love that had somehow survived every obstacle their difficult circumstances had placed before them. Elinor accepted through happy tears, feeling none of the fear and uncertainty that had once dominated every aspect of her existence, replaced instead by a profound sense of security and belonging that she had never expected to experience again after her family's devastating rejection. The wedding that followed several weeks later was a joyful celebration attended by everyone who had played a meaningful role in their difficult but ultimately triumphant journey toward each other, from Beatrice, who served proudly as a witness to their vows, to Margaret Colby, seated in a place of honor despite her humble circumstances, to Charles Winters, whose simple question had first planted the seeds of doubt that eventually led the Duke to reconsider his hasty judgment. Standing before the assembled guests in a gown of soft ivory silk, Elinor felt none of the anxiety that had once characterized every interaction with people of wealth and status, secure now in her own worth and identity rather than the false pretenses that had once defined her presence in this world. As she exchanged vows with the man who had once cast her from his home in anger, only to search tirelessly until he found her again, she reflected on the strange, winding path that had brought her to this moment of profound happiness. She thought of that terrible night when her own family had turned their backs on her without hesitation, and she felt no bitterness remaining, only a quiet gratitude that their cruelty had, however painfully, set her upon a path that eventually led to this new family, chosen not by blood but by genuine love and mutual respect that no financial hardship or social pressure could ever hope to diminish. She thought of the desperate, frightened girl who had collapsed near an unfamiliar gate, believing her life essentially over, and marveled at how completely her circumstances had transformed through nothing more than a single, honest mistake that had opened an unexpected door toward genuine happiness. As the Duke slipped a ring onto her finger, sealing their union before family, friends, and the quiet witnesses to their difficult journey, Elinor understood with complete clarity that her destiny had indeed been changed forever, not through calculation or scheme, but through the simple, powerful truth that sometimes the greatest transformations in life emerge from the most unexpected mistakes, when met with courage, honesty, and the willingness to forgive both others and ourselves for the imperfect choices that difficult circumstances sometimes force upon us. She had been deserted by the family who should have loved her unconditionally, but through one man's mistake, and his even greater courage in correcting it, she had found a new family, a new home, and a love more genuine and lasting than anything she could have imagined during those darkest hours when hope had seemed entirely lost to her.